Good afternoon. My name is Dan Biddle, president of Genesis Apologetics. I have been at Bayside Church for over 20 years. Love this ministry, love the congregation here. And I'm super excited today to share about Noah's flood. About 15 years ago, I ran into the truth of Noah's flood. I'm an evidence guy by nature. I was a testifying behavioral scientist in the federal and state courts for about 20 years. I love evidence. And about 15 years ago, I pressure tested the topic of Noah's flood every which way possible, every way I could. I looked at geology and the dinosaurs and paleontology and all the different evidence platforms to see if I could build a case for Noah's flood. And I have to say, about halfway through that journey, I became not only somewhat convinced of Noah's flood, I became overwhelmingly convinced of the preponderance of evidence of Noah's flood. And for me, it was a life-changing experience. So what I hope to do today is share with you about the top 10 evidences of Noah's flood. I actually think there's about 20 top evidences, but today I boil it down for the top 10. If you'd like to see the top 20, they're really included in our movie that hit the theaters last year. The movie's called The Ark in the Darkness. It's available on YouTube free, or you can get it on Amazon and Apple TV and Google Play and some other platforms as well. But The Ark in the Darkness is about an hour and 52 long minute movie. And it includes probably the top 20 evidences of Noah's flood, but today we're just going to cover the top 10. So let's go ahead and learn a little bit about our ministry first. Our ministry is called Genesis Apologetics. We have about 30 million views on YouTube. That's really our platform. We build a lot of short form videos and put them out on YouTube. We have a pretty significant following on Instagram and Facebook as well. We have another movie called Genesis Impact that we would recommend that you watch before going into a public natural history museum, because it compares and contrasts a creationist worldview from an evolutionary worldview before you go into museums. We have a movie called Foundations that really stresses the importance of raising your kids with a biblical worldview. All of these are available free as a good place to start on our website. We have two different programs. One is for 5th to 10th graders called debunkevolution.com, and another one is called 7 Myths. You can also access those resources free online. They're used by a lot of different Christian schools and homeschoolers alike. We have a book on the Bible and science on gender, sex, and marriage. We took a scientific approach to gender and showed that the Genesis idea of a binary phenomenon of gender is really a true thing, both scientifically and biblically. We also have a book that supplements our movie called The Ark in the Darkness. It's all the evidence and the details and the footnotes of the resources that I'm going to be covering today. And we have a book about giants and the Nephilim, which is also part of the reason why God sent the flood. And you can also see the evidence that's presented in that book. Our most popular book is called The Answers to the Top 50 Questions About Genesis, Creation, and Noah's Flood. For several years, our ministry got the same questions over and over again, about the top 3 or 4 dozen questions on the same types of topics. So we built this book as really a platform for answering the top 50 questions about Genesis, creation, and the flood. And the neat thing about this book is that it points to video resources that help complement the answers that are in writing in this book. We also have a mobile app that you can download for free. Over 100,000 people have done so, and this mobile app points back to a number of our videos, or our leading videos that are on YouTube. So it's a great way to learn about our resources. We have an annual conference that we hold at William Jessup. Typically 600 or 700 people attend that every year. This year it's going to be at William Jessup on February 28th from about 9 to 4 p.m. And you can see the details here on your screen. But we do hold that conference every year. You can just go to g1conference.com to find the updated materials about that. This next year, we have a movie called Out of Babel coming out, which is really a follow-up to our flood movie, but we stress the similarities that happened between the North American Native Americans, which had all kinds of records on Genesis motifs or Genesis themes, because they knew that history coming from Babel. And then we show how the Pilgrims, when they landed in 1620, were able to compare and contrast with the Native Americans similar histories that the Europeans carried and the North American natives carried, as well as many different native tribes carried similar histories being dispersed from Babel just thousands of years ago. But that movie should come out in 2026. And here is a link for our free movie about Noah's flood. Just go to noahsflood.com, plural but no apostrophe s, just noahsflood.com. It was in about 1,000 theaters in 2024. It's been watched by millions of people, both in the theaters and online. We have a 43-minute version, a 58-minute version, and of course the full-length version, all of which can be seen at noahsflood.com. If you're a teacher or an educator, you can go to this website, genesisapologetics.com/flood, and you can download all of our free books about Noah's flood. We have a student workbook that you can download and see the shorter 43-minute movie there and the 58-minute movie there as well. So here are 5 reasons why I think Noah's flood is a game changer to both students and parents, and of course educators. The first reason is that students really want to know, is the Bible just myth or is it history? I think a number of us, especially new Christians, have heard about Noah's flood, but just the idea of a global cataclysm like Noah's flood is sometimes a hard pill to swallow for people. But students want to know, is it a myth or is it real history? It really does anchor the Bible in a very concrete way. If Noah's flood happened as described in the Bible, it should be a way to build your faith on real history and real facts, not just on feelings or not just on some echo of a story that happened in distant past. There is real, tangible, hard evidence of Noah's flood, and I would argue it's also worldwide. It also can set our faith apart from the secular narrative. Every time you walk into a secular museum, you're going to see the ideas of millions of years of evolution and the idea of Pangea and how it broke apart and where the dinosaurs fit in history and things like that. But Noah's flood is a completely different paradigm. It's a completely different way of looking at world history. And if you understand the biblical account of Noah's flood and you go in some of those secular institutions, you can see a clear compare and contrast. And I think for Christians, that really solidifies us as a distinguished people who understand the truth about Earth history compared to the narrative that the world would have us believe. The other thing that's very interesting to consider about Noah's flood is that there are 9 Bible authors or characters whose credibility depend on the flood being a real event. And these are no second-class characters or authors. Of course, Jesus himself talked about the flood as a real narrative. We've got Peter, Moses, Isaiah, Ezekiel, David, the author of Hebrews, Matthew, and Luke. They all talk about flood. And I would also add that the book of Jude also alludes to Noah's flood by way of the judgment. So now we're up to 9 or maybe 10 different authors or characters in the Bible that are all crucial to God's word being true or not. And if the Noah's flood didn't happen, if it's just a story, their credibility, even the credibility of Jesus, would be undermined. So it's a very significant litmus test for our faith. And then, of course, Jesus himself sets the flood up as a reminder of the coming judgment. So let's look at what Jesus said about the flood. He says, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but only my Father. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days of Noah before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be." So Jesus, our Lord, draws this comparison. He says, look, in the days of Noah, people had no idea that the judgment was going to come. They were having parties and getting married and planning to get married, a life as usual, and suddenly destruction was upon them and took them all away. And Jesus draws this parallel to the coming of the end of the age when he returns. So I think that's a very profound example given by our Lord himself about the significance of Noah's flood. Then we have the narrative of Peter, and I think this is, for me, one of the most crucial passages about Noah's flood, because Peter is writing this as one of the last few chapters he ever wrote before he disappears from the pages of Scripture. And he says himself, above all. So he says, this is what the thing I'm going to say next is really, really important. He says, above everything, you must understand that in the last days, scoffers will come scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, where is this coming that Jesus promised? For ever since our ancestors died, everything goes on just as it has since the beginning of creation. So there's been no interruptions since the beginning of creation. Long ages, nothing's happened. We don't have to worry about God or his judgments. He says that's what they're going to say. But then he says they're going to deliberately forget. They're going to intentionally deny. They're going to forget on purpose, like as been taught by many of the secular school books nowadays. It's an intentional or willingly denying about Noah's flood, because he says they're going to deliberately forget that long ago by God's word the heavens came into being. So the Bible's very clear about the mechanics of creation. It says God spoke. After each of the 6 days, God said, and these things happen. And at the very end of creation, he says, behold, it is very good. So it says that by the word of God, the heavens came into being, and the earth was formed out of water and by water. The Latin term we use to explain that is called ex nihilo, or spoken into existence from nothing. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. That's Noah's flood. By the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. So if you go get a secular degree in almost any college today, they are going to intentionally teach against and deny creation out of nothing and Noah's flood. You can't get a degree in even art these days without taking general ed classes in secular institutions that are going to deny those two things. Creation out of nothing, that God spoke it by himself. He spoke it into existence out of nothing. And they're also going to deny a recent deluge, a worldwide cataclysm of Noah's flood. And we see that happening today, probably more so than ever. So, and of course, we have the enemy. This is a sign that's from the Ark exhibit done by Answers in Genesis. It's an incredible place. If you haven't been there, they have a full-size Ark exhibit. You can just go to arkencounter.com, I believe is the website. This is a picture we took at that great full-size replica of Noah's Ark. And this is the enemy wrapped around the plaque, and it says here, if I can convince you that the flood was not real, then I can convince you that the heaven and hell are not real. So while Noah's flood is taught as a fantasy in today's colleges, it's oftentimes equated with the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a spin-off or an echo of Noah's flood. It's oftentimes equated. There's a biblical myth, or the Epic of Gilgamesh myth. That's what's commonly taught today in a number of secular institutions. They mythologize the biblical narrative of Noah's flood by equating it with the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's more frequently taught than you might know. It's all actually that one two-step phenomenon is happening all over America, where they're mythologizing Noah's flood. So Christians today have to know that if it's really just a myth, then Satan wins. He says, well, look, if the flood is a myth, then Jesus' words are also a myth, and the gospel must also be a myth. So it's a very, very important topic. So let's transition here and look at an overview of what happened about Noah's flood, and then we'll dig into the 10 different leading evidences. So when did it happen? Well, if you just take the Masoretic set of texts, from a literal standpoint, you can go back to about 2348 BC, or about 4,400 years ago, and that's where Noah's flood would be parked under the classical narrative. There are some things that you can do with Abraham's lifespan that might bring the flood back as far as 2518 or so BC. But then if you want to adhere to the Septuagint set of texts, and there's a lot of credibility to this perspective, to the Septuagint set of texts, then the flood could be parked back as far as about 3168 BC. But either way, right within that bracket of time, it's either going to be the Masoretic dates or the Septuagint dates. That would be the classical Orthodox position of understanding when the flood happened. But the thing that I find interesting about Noah's flood is you can get there one of two ways. You can start at creation and the narrative of Genesis, and you can add up all the ages of the patriarch, and you get under the classic Masoretic standpoint, you could get about 1656 years after creation is when the flood would have happened. Or you can start from today and go backwards using Luke 3, Genesis 5, and Genesis 10 and calculate it backwards going that way. But either way, you're going to be stuck within that bracket, at least from a biblical standpoint, regarding when the flood happened. Here's what Luke chapter 3 does. It takes the 77 patriarchs from Jesus and goes straight back through the line of David Abraham, Noah, all the way back to Adam. 77 generations. It hops back through these patriarchs and lands at Adam just about 6,000 years ago under a classic biblical narrative. Now, I understand there are lots of other Christians that don't take this narrative literally. Our ministry does. There's all kinds of Christians that are true Christians that have perspectives that are different from this. But today our ministry is just going to be speaking from a very classic narrative, a very natural way of interpreting Scripture, a literal historical way of doing it. But here we have the 77 patriarchs, and we can use this for dating Noah's flood, going from Jesus backwards about 4,000 years, or from Adam all the way up to Noah about 1,656 years after creation. But either way, that's where we can timeline and bracket the timeline for Noah's flood. Well, what about the flood itself? How long did it last? Well, the Bible's very clear. If you look at Genesis chapters 6, 7, 8, and some of 9, you can see that the flood lasted 371 days. The Bible says that the ark didn't even get buoyant until the 40th day of the flood process. The water didn't peak until about 150 days into the flood. Then the water receded for about 150 days, and the earth dried out for about 70. So that's an overview of the 1-year process of Noah's flood. And the Bible's very clear that Noah wrote it down from a diary historical standpoint with all kinds of different events that we can use during the flood process to estimate that it was a 371-day process. Here's more of a schematic showing the different markers of the significant Bible verses that we can time the different events of the flood. The Bible's very clear about when it began and how the flooding started with the coastal regions and the shallow seas. The ark didn't get buoyant until about the 40th day, then it peaked at the 150th day. Then the water began retreating off for the 150 days, and earth dried out for about 70 days. But when the water began retreating off the continents, it first began in sheet flow as the fountains of the great deep were shut. The seafloor lowered back down, peeling the water back off of the continents, and I'll show you the mechanisms for this as we go through. And when it did that, it first came off in sheet flow and then started in channelized flow, leaving the channelized cuts that we see as markers all over, especially North America. There's all types of places where you can see the channelized cuts, like Arches National Park, where you can see the layers of the flood and how the flood first came off in sheets, then it began in channelized cuts as less water was there, and it was finally removed off of the continents. So that's an overview of how it happened. And the most frequent question that we get is, well, my gosh, how could the flood be true if there are millions and millions of species alive today? So if you just look at the idea of species, well, today it would just mean animals that are generally interfertile, but it goes a little bit further than that. And I'll show you what we're talking about here, because all Noah had to do was bring about 7,000 animals total, 1,500 different types of animals, because he brought 2 of some kind, 7 of another kind. And if you start peeling the species back on the animal trees and go back to about the family level on the biological tree, we can see things like Canis lupus familiaris, or the wolf kind. Well, the wolf, the dog kind, goes back to a common kind. It wasn't even the wolf, it was before the wolf. And there's 339 dog breeds today, but they can be mapped back to the wolf or a similar ancestor before that. Same thing with horses. All horses today, you can take a miniature horse and a Clydesdale, they're still technically interfertile. It's amazing, the most amazing thing. They're all the same kind. They can still all interbreed, but there's 336 breeds of them. Chickens, same things. They're all interfertile today. There's 68 different breeds. And the bear family is interesting. The Ursidae family is called the bear family. There are 5 of the 8 species in the Ursidae bear family that can still interbreed today. You can take a black bear or a polar bear, and you can interbreed them with a grizzly bear, and they call them different names, but 5 of the 8 species in that family are still today interfertile. So you can quickly see, as you begin paring back, scaling back the animal tree, you can only need about 1,500 different kinds of animals, 7,000 total because it was 2 of some kind, 7 of other kinds. and the male and female of each, and you can bring just those representatives aboard the ark. They get off several thousand years ago, then they populate, spread around the world, and then speciate and turn into different breeds and species that we would see today. Now, also notice that he didn't have to bring insects aboard the ark, and he didn't have to bring fish and all the marine life aboard the ark. Over 90% of the fossils we see today, just by sheer counts, are marine fossils. None of those things had to be aboard the ark. It was just, the Bible's very clear, if it breathed in life through its nasal passages, which insects do not do, and then it was a land-dwelling animal, it was aboard the ark. So that's how we boil it down to just about 7,000 total animals. That's a number from Answers in Genesis. They have lots of scientific experts called baraminologists that have studied these animal kinds and varieties before. That's how they get the number of 1,500 different varieties or kinds of animals. So let's look at the first evidence. I'd like to start here because I think it's a big, broad, sweeping way of looking at the evidence. It's that the fact that we have echoes and myths and legends of Noah's flood in literally every major people group around the world. The evidence was really done by this guy, Bill Cooper, just decades ago. He came out with charts like this where he would take all the different cultures and countries around the world, take basic elements and characteristics and things that happened during the flood, and develop maps and grid work showing, my goodness, there's all kinds of different cultures and people groups around the world that share flood stories, worldwide flood stories, that have similar characteristics about them that sound an awful lot like Noah's flood. Like there was a favored family, it was going to be divine destruction, a universal destruction, the animals were going to be saved, a human family was going to be saved. That work started just decades ago. He established hundreds of different flood accounts. And we have even things like this, that to write in ancient Chinese characters, the character that would mean large ship, well, you have to write 8 people on a boat. And it's quite interesting that we have on Noah's flood, we have Noah and his wife, and Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their 3 wives, 8 people on a ship. So we can see there a very clear echo in the ancient Chinese characters about Noah's flood. Then the research got a little bit more thorough and updated with Neil LaGuardia. He wrote a book just recently called Echoes of Ararat. He focused first on North and South America and developed over 300 accounts from independent cultures and communities. And those 2 continents, he's since done a lot of other areas around the world. And he's developed a book that has 300 accounts from just North and South America on Noah's flood. So we can see the echo happening in all these different cultures. So if we start at the ziggurat of where we still have the leftover foundation of the Tower of Babel, and we go up from there, each one of these dots is a culture that has a story about a worldwide inundation. So every single one of these yellow dots that we see as we spin the globe and go around the earth, there's pockets like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand that are just chock full of an echo, a retelling of Noah's flood. A lot of times there's a lot of similarities and overlaps. Sometimes there's distinctions. When we get to South America, same thing. Tons of independent stories about Noah's flood. And the Native Americans, you could write volumes and volumes of the stories and myths and legends from the Native Americans. In fact, that's what happened when the Europeans arrived in North America. The Jesuits and the explorers and others began interviewing the Native Americans about their histories. And it's not just a strand theme, it's a common theme. In most every major Native American tribe, they all have a story about a worldwide flood. And sometimes the characters' names, the processes, the fact that they're releasing birds, or he was in a canoe and he had his wife, the overlap and the similarities and the consistencies that are right on top of Noah's flood will give you chills. It's incredible what the Native Americans alone have the account and the retelling of Noah's flood. And Nick has got all of that in his book. So let's look at the ancient Near East, because there are 6 different primary echoes that were very recent echoes from the Noah's flood account. So we have the historical account and where the ark would have landed, not necessarily on Mount Ararat, but on the mountains of Ararat. We don't necessarily know where the ark is today. That's another story for another time. But around that area, around the ancient Near East, we have 6 different primary flood accounts, myths and legends that came after the biblical account. Things like the Enuma Elish, the Sumerians' King's List, the Eridu Tablet, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Simon's Ark Tablet, the Atrahasis Epic. All of these things radiated out from the same region where Noah's flood itself happened, or where the ark landed and where the accounts would have emanated from. So that's where they spread. Here's what some of these legends look like. Most of them are carved on cuneiform or clay tablets. That's how we get these accounts today. But the amazing thing you'll find about these accounts is that if you look back through history, legends don't tend to get more truthful. As legends and myth travel through time, they get more and more mythical. So when you look at the biblical narrative, you've got a diary from Noah himself that's over 2 to 3 chapters long, that's echoed, by 8 other biblical authors, 8 or 9 other biblical authors. And that account is so historical with facts and dates and times and what happened at different locations and when, and the different stages of the flood and the length and the dimensions of the ark. It's all very clear what happened. And when we take these 6 different flood echoes from the ancient Near East, they get more and more mythical over time. I'll show you what we mean. These 6 different accounts and others all have these 8 common elements in these major flood accounts. Things like God's going to bring a punishment. There's going to be one chosen guy with his family, and the animals are going to get saved. God gives a vessel with certain specifications. They're going to survive the flood. The birds are going to go out to find dry land. Sacrifice is going to be made to God after. A lot of these common themes are in the retelling of the accounts with the major ancient Near Eastern accounts, as well as the different echoes that go around the world. They're all carrying these similar tones. The main source is with Scripture. And a lot of these common things just continue to radiate out like layers on an onion that just go back out from the original. What about the earliest writings in the world? This is a very interesting topic because the honest scholars that look at how we can date ancient writings will only go back about 3,500 years. In fact, we have some amazing statements from the British Library themselves about cuneiform writing. They can carbon date things that they think go back further, but when it comes to actually dating, reliably dating using triangulation, that when these dates were written so that they can tie it to actual events that they've seen happen in history, they only go back about 3,500 years. So we have things like the Greeks, the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Egyptian medical document that we have that goes back 3,500 years, the Sumerians, the Hebrews, the Chinese. For some reason, it's very interesting, the ancient writings from every major culture group around the world goes back to about the time of Noah's flood, and then it just vanishes off the face of the earth, which is exactly what you would expect to happen if Noah's flood really happened. So what are we going to do when it comes back before the flood? You can open up a 6th grade textbook today, and it will say written history is only 5,000 to 6,000 years. But we would argue that you have to start using inference to go back 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years using carbon dating and some other things that are tools that we know aren't entirely reliable. They can give good benchmarks for things, but when you start getting precise by century, some of those dating mechanisms get rather weak. They have wider, what we call standard errors of prediction. So here we have it. All these different major histories and writings of these different people groups that go back and they fizzle about the time that Noah's flood happened. So we have a bracket that we can triangulate these dates using more concrete methods, but after that it gets really inferential and they all disappear around the same time that Noah's flood happens. Well, what about evidence number 2? So we'll look at the feasibility of the flood process compared to every other ancient Near Eastern flood account. Well, the Bible says that God himself gave the dimensions to Noah. He says he gave him 300 cubits by 50 by 30, I believe, was a cubits, which translates to a dimension of a ship that was over 500 feet long. And then he says 3 different floors or stories he was going to give it. It's going to be covered with pitch on the inside and the outside. Some really smart scientists have taken those dimensions and pressure tested it over at the Chryso Ship Research Center in Korea. and learn that the structure, the dimensions, and how that ship was framed according to the divine dimensions given by God to Noah were really ideal with respect to stability, strength, and comfort. And they tried to capsize it. They used simulated tidal waves or tsunamis and showed that it can really only go up to 45 degrees each side, even sometimes past that, and still right itself. It was an amazingly designed ship. When we compare that to the ancient Near Eastern specifications, like the Simmons Ark tablet, which had a circular ship, or the Gilgamesh Ark, which had 6 or 7 different stories to it, was in a cube shape, and you compare that to the biblical ark, which was shaped more like a barge, using the same types of dimensions that are used for container ships that are coming intercontinentally today. We clearly have a winner with the dimensions given to Noah's Ark. So it took Noah and his family, and perhaps others, between 55 and 75 years, we can infer that from Scripture, to build it. It was over 550 feet long, 15 feet long. Was in the ocean for about 371 days, but only really floating until it hit land. It was definitely seaworthy, but when you contrast that with the Epic of Gilgamesh, well, that accounts as it only took a week. It took them a week to build it. It was 200 feet square on each side. It took them only 1 week. It was only in the ocean a week. Definitely not seaworthy. We can run simulations for the dimensions of the ark and see how incredibly stable it would have been. We actually hired some hydrophysics experts to take the dimensions of the ark, contrast it with the Epic of Gilgamesh by using what's called the Beaufort storm scale, where you can go from light rain all the way up to huge hurricanes and big massive waves to see how it would have withstood. Then, of course, the Epic of Gilgamesh begins tumbling after Beaufort storm scale 7 or 8. It begins toppling and turning over. You definitely couldn't have animals alive in that, but Noah's Ark was really, really hard to capsize or turn upside down or anything like that. It was a very stable design. Evidence number 3, let's look at this. Unimaginable numbers of dead dinosaurs mixed with marine life. This is probably one of the most convincing aspects about Noah's flood. If you have a 5-minute coffee talk with someone, just ask them, well, look, if Noah's flood didn't happen, how do you fill 14 states and stuff them with dead dinosaurs, in some cases under 100 or 200 feet of mud? We're talking about 3 different countries that are encapsulated in this area in the middle of America that stretches 1,800 miles long by 1,000 miles wide, about 1 million square miles of area between Canada, America, and Mexico is stuffed, says the fossil record, with dead dinosaurs mixed with marine life. How do you fill over a 14-state region with land creatures and marine creatures, jumble them up, mix them together, and bury them under 100 feet or more of mud? It would take something like Noah's flood to do that. I'll show you by illustration by looking at just one of those areas in the heart of that dinosaur kill zone that I just showed you. It's a geological formation called the Morrison Formation. The Morrison Formation itself is about 600,000 square miles of the 1 million square mile region that I just showed you. But let's take a look by zooming into the Morrison Formation, into the town called Morrison, and let's take a cross-sectional cut of the geology of that region just to see how thick the Morrison Formation is, because you're going to find it's like a 300-foot thick mud pancake that goes over 600,000 square miles, touches boundaries of 13 different states, just the Morrison Formation, and it's stuffed filled with marine life and dinosaurs. How do you do that without a worldwide flood? And it's 300 feet thick. We can take a look at that by comparison. We can fly down a Boeing 747 and see just how deep, in fact, that is. Imagine that depth of a mud pancake that spans 600,000 miles, covering 13 different states in the middle of America. That's pretty incredible. We can fly in even the Empire State Building and see there as well how deep that is and how far it covers. And the most amazing thing is that this entire picture here, with all of these different species of dinosaurs, over 50 different varieties of dinosaurs, are all found in the Morrison Formation. Every single one of these species bought it during Noah's flood, and they're buried in those layers across a 600,000 mile expanse. But the big tell is that they're also buried with marine life. So a huge, very wide, obvious example of Noah's flood right here in the middle of America. So that's how we can bury this huge big swath of land, 1,800 miles long by 1,000 miles wide. It would take something like Noah's flood to do that. When we start looking at these dinosaurs at a microscopic level, we also see evidence that leads towards Noah's flood. The macro level evidence points to Noah's flood as well. If you just step back and look at everything from a big expansive standpoint like we just looked at, that points to Noah's flood. But when you get down and look at these dinosaur bones at a microscopic level, you see the same type of truth emerges about Noah's flood. This is a listing of over 120 peer-reviewed scientific journals that are not creationist publications. These are all genuine peer-reviewed scientific journals. Over 120 of them report finding soft tissue in ancient bones. 50 of these articles alone just point to dinosaurs. So we can see it begins really in the 50s and 60s, but most of the literature started coming out in the 70s and 80s and even after that. But the most incredible stuff just came out in the last 10 years or so, where they found 16 different varieties of bioorganic materials found in dinosaur bones. Now, in the past, they didn't really know this stuff existed because they weren't bothering to look for it, because they thought that these dinosaurs went extinct by other means millions and millions of years ago. But if Noah's flood happened, and it happened worldwide and happened just recently, we would expect to find some bioorganics still preserved in these dinosaur bones because they were encapsulated by mud quickly, and that's exactly what we find. We find things like this, Triceratops soft tissue and a Triceratops horn that can still be stretched. It's still pliable. This is Dr. Mark Armitage that has done this work. There's lots of other scientists that have done it as well. This is a clip from our movie where you can demineralize the bone and you can see there are still soft, pliable bioorganics left that can be stretched with forceps under a microscope. Very, very interesting. So there we have 120 peer-reviewed journal articles, and here's what some of these bioorganics looks like. The list just goes on and on and on. The last two things that they just found were actual real dinosaur cartilage, not imprints of cartilage, not leftover pieces of cartilage that were not real bioorganic, but actual dinosaur cartilage that has been chemically tested to be the same, and nerve fibers. How in the world can these things last for millions and millions of years when they say that dinosaurs went extinct 65 or 66 million years ago? We wouldn't expect to find these things, but we find these things because these animals were covered just thousands of years ago, entombed rapidly in mud, which is the mechanism for preservation. But the big telling thing is collagen. So that's, of the 16 different types of bioorganics, the one that really clinches the case for Noah's flood is collagen, because there's been at least 5 different scientific studies that investigated the half-life and the longer complete shelf life of collagen to see how long it could last under ideal conditions or cold conditions or just normal conditions like what we would see. These 5 different studies have estimated that if you take collagen, which is the soft, pliable material that makes up about 40% of bones, and the rest is the hard mineral parts of bones. About 40% of these bones are collagen, providing the soft, pliable, stretchy connective tissue that's inside of these bones. These 5 different studies have estimated, well, some of them will say, well, maybe 10 to 30,000 years is as long as collagen can last. Well, some scientists will say maybe 100,000 years. The Buckley study that came out said, well, maybe 300,000 to 900,000 years is the upper limit that they're going to give to collagen. So when you take a bone and you throw it out in the mud and it's going to get covered rapidly, they would say that the hard bone mineral can stay preserved for a long time, but the soft, fleshy material like the collagen should all be decayed in just thousands of years. 5 different studies. There's not yet been a single study that will give it longer than 1 million years. So if that's really the case, how on the earth is collagen, which has now been confirmed to be found in dinosaur bones, at the molecular level, which is organic to the creature. That was a discovery that happened about 10 years ago, and it's been since replicated. There's all kinds of scientific shows that are coming out on this now. We submitted a bone that went off for study where they found hydroxyprolone, and that went all over the scientific news. It's now cased closed. They're finding collagen in dinosaur bones that's organic to the creatures. It's not intrusion, it's not contamination. It's real collagen that belonged to the dinosaur. In fact, they're even going to be making dinosaur handbags because they're able to replicate what the collagen would have looked like. So it's out. The collagen has been found. There's been 5 different studies that estimate how long it can be, how long it can last, and not a single study can show how collagen can last more than 1 million years. So how can we hold this narrative that the dinosaurs went extinct by an asteroid 65 or 66 million years ago when the best science of today says there's no way collagen can last at a maximum in the ideal frozen conditions 900,000 years? Somehow they've got to make dinosaur collagen last dozens of times longer than the science shows it can actually last. So when you look at the collagen, it should all be gone within 1 million years. How are they finding it still in dinosaurs that are supposedly 65 million years? The science doesn't line up with the evolutionary timeline. It clearly fits with the biblical narrative that these dinosaurs were rapidly entombed by mud and ash during Noah's flood, and they were preserved for just thousands of years, so we can dig them up now and find collagen in a number of samples, which is exactly what we'd expect to find, but not over hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years or not even millions of years. So the narrative that happened in the paleontology fields from 1850 to 1960, if really the consensus, in fact, our ministry went back and bought thousands of dollars worth of paleontology books, geology books, and fossil books and histology books, and looked at what the common narrative was between 1850 and 1960. And did you know that the overwhelming consensus within those scientific fields based upon those books, they all were in perfect agreement? We can't really find any books before 1960 that really clearly said, well, maybe they have soft tissues in them. The consensus perspective was all dinosaur bones are stones. I would say maybe 99%. That was the perspective. Paleontologists, you go to Harvard, interview the paleontologists, look at the books. They're very, very clear. All dinosaur bones are just stones. But then from 1960 to 2025, now we have 120 publications by hundreds and hundreds of scientists. The truth has come out that they're not just stones. So now 0% of the scientific community can make that statement. So now they have to say all dinosaur bones are stones. They can no longer make that statement. So how on earth can we have this paradigm shifting evidence come out when we used to say this, but now we can't anymore, and it's a 100% shift? Yet scientists are still holding on to the evolutionary timeline when the evidence shows that the demise of the dinosaur clearly lines up with a worldwide event that happened just thousands of years ago. I think the case is very close in that regard, especially with collagen, which has yet to be dated with any type of method where they can show it can stretch out for 65 million years. It's just impossible. Evidence number 5 is that the rapid catastrophic burial of dinosaurs mixed with marine life. Here's a guy, Jack Horner, who came out with a book called Digging Dinosaurs, but look at the subtitle. He says, The Search That Unraveled the Mystery of Baby Dinosaurs. So he finds this huge bone bed of Maiasaur dinosaurs, which can get up over 20 feet tall. He found a huge bed of Maiasaur bones that stretched 1.25 miles going from east to west, so it was a directional deposit. He says there were up to 30 million fragments in that area. They had discovered the tomb of 10,000 dinosaurs. Well, the mystery that he had to search for is how on earth did they only find, they found 10,000 adult Maiasaurs, but they found 0 young. All of the bone fragments that they found in that entire 1 1/4 mile long stretch that went from east to west, all of it was all adults. They didn't find a single bone scrap of any adolescent, teen, or baby Maiasaur. Every one of the fossils that they found were from an adult creature between 9 and 23 feet. What on earth could do that? What could take an entire herd of over 10,000 of these creatures and get them to panic and stampede away from all of the young, leaving them behind while they were crushed and wrecked and buried rapidly in Noah's flood. I think that's a very interesting evidence. We find the same thing here by looking at the bone beds and with over 100,000 dinosaurs that are now found and represented in museums. 97% of them are found disarticulated. Only 3% are found complete and articulated, and that's because Noah's flood was like a gigantic blender. A lot of these animals, such as in the Lance Formation, they were hit and killed at one location, and the bones were transported and buried in graded, sorted beds at other locations. So again, more evidence for the flood. Dr. Carl Warner's got a great book out on the fossil record that shows how this can be substantiated. And we oftentimes find dinosaurs in the famous death pose, choking for air and suffocating with their necks arched back as they're trying to breathe and reach for air as they're getting buried rapidly by mud. They've actually replicated this study by burying chickens alive and showed during that last stage of the death process, they are in fact arching their necks backwards, trying to grasp for air as they're dying. And that's exactly what happened with these big theropods. You can see this famous death pose throughout museums in America. Evidence number 6 is that the 3 different products that dinosaurs are found in. I find this very interesting. There's a consistent theme when you go to dinosaur dig sites, particularly in the Midwest, where you find dinosaurs buried in a matrix of 3 different products: mud, sand, and ash. So whatever your worldview is, however you're going to view these dead dinosaurs, you have to come up with a mechanism for explaining why these dinosaur bones are found in a matrix of those 3 products: mud, sand, and ash. What on earth could do that? We think it's a perfect evidence that's been left behind for Noah's flood. When we have volcanism going on, we have tidal waves from the flood. That's why we find them buried in mud, sand, and ash. We'll explain that a little bit more as we go here. But it's interesting to think that the Bible's the only ancient text that describes how the flood happened, including both timeline and process, and it actually gets it right. When you think about this, the Bible makes this huge claim of a worldwide flood. Other religious texts make similar claims, but are they also matched with such a mountain of evidence as compared to Noah's flood account in the Bible? I would say the Bible is very clear, and the Bible even stretches out and explains the processes and the mechanisms of the flood. And I'll show you how the Bible can actually explain why these dinosaurs are found in matrices of mud, sand, and ash. It makes a great explanation when you look at verses like this, Genesis 7:11. It's the 600th year of Noah's life. They lived longer back then because they had fewer mutations. In the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, sounds like a history book already, on the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. So the flood started on the ocean floor, and then it didn't zenith until day 150. That's when the Bible says that the highest mountains were covered with 15 cubits, or about 22 feet of water, where they completely submerged. So we're talking about very specific mechanisms and processes that are described in the Bible. We might even be able to show how tsunamis are explained by the Bible when Genesis 8:3 says that the waters receded from the earth, going forth and returning, and at the end of 150 days the water decreased. That could be explaining a tidal wave mechanism where the water's coming out and sheeting back, coming out and sheeting back, and we'll show that that's actually the mechanics of how the flood happened. This all came out, this theory that I'm going to explain today called catastrophic plate tectonics was founded by Dr. John Baumgardner and 5 other really smart PhD scientists, and they called it the catastrophic plate tectonics. And here's an article that came out in U.S. News and World Report. They called it the geophysics of God, when these guys broke out in the 1990s and came up with a model that I think clearly explains how the flood really happened. Here's a software simulation showing Pangea breaking up when all of the fountains of the great deep broke open on the same day. It's a 40,000-mile network called the Mid-Ocean Ridge that broke apart when the fountains of the great deep broke open. And the Earth's continents that were at that time in one major landmass began breaking apart during the flood. We have another simulation here. You can see the red dot is Chicago, we can see how the fountains of the great deep would have broken open and shoved these continents apart by seafloor spreading. Here we have the mid-Atlantic ridge opening up. It's pushing these continents apart. We believe that Pangaea clearly broke open during Noah's flood. Here's a mid-Atlantic ridge, which itself is a 10,000-mile seam. And we can see here that the 3,000 miles between this area and this area fit perfectly together, and the mid-Atlantic ridge is exactly in the middle. This is about a 3,100-mile spread. The mid-Atlantic ridge is at 1,500 miles, right between those two spread areas. We can see here a bathymetric map that shows the same thing, how these continents were pushed apart. When you take the water out of the ocean, it becomes even more visible and more pronounced that these continents were pushed apart by the fountains of the great deep breaking open. Here we have another picture showing the 40,000 miles spread of this oceanic rifts. That's where the fountains of the great deep are. And that's what produced the mechanism of mud, sand, that produced mud, sand, and ash. And that's how the dinosaurs are buried there. So we have the subduction happening from the seafloor being rapidly formed when the spreading was happening, because the lava comes up, forms new seafloor that spreads like a conveyor belt going out in two different directions. It hits into the landmass, begins to dive under, and then releases and causes cycles of tsunamis that are coming up on land and burying these dinosaurs in layers, which is exactly what we see them doing today when we dig them up. And it also would have produced ash. When the subduction's happening, it creates all these hazards and all these volcanic systems along the continental edges, creating the mechanism for lots and lots of ash to be bellowed forth and spread all over the place. So here's a simulation of what that might have looked like when the fountains of the great deep broke open. We can see the underwater lava coming out. It's going to spread the new seafloor coming up. It's going to have these linear steam jets come up. It's going to bring the tsunamis up on land over and over again. You have the linear split that's happening all over the world now. It's creating new seafloor. It's going to go hit the landmass, develop tension, bind, and release, and that's what's going to cause the tsunamis coming up in cycles. Here's another animation. The fountains of the great deep are breaking open, forming new seafloor. It's going out bidirectionally like a massive conveyor belt. And when it spreads, it's going to come up and it's going to hit the landmass, and it's going to begin building up tension here, and then it's going to release. This is how a lot of tsunamis and earthquakes start today, with subduction-related earthquakes. When it happens, it's going to bring up all these tsunamis, and it's going to be burying these creatures in layers. And that's exactly how we see dinosaurs today when we uncover them. It's called the study of taphonomy. They are buried in mud, sand, and ash. You have to have a mechanism for doing that. Noah's flood does it. It also shows how the ash would have come from that subduction-related event. It's going to come up and rain down on the dinosaurs, and that's why they're found buried in huge areas where we have the ash. This is the Independence Dyke Swarm. It's a 375-mile linear rift system that's in Southern California. It bellowed out over 4,000 cubic miles of ash, creating areas like the Brushy Basin member, which is about 200,000 square miles, which is 50% just ash, and it's burying all kinds of dinosaurs in this 4-state region. That member alone, which is about 600 miles by 300 miles and about 200,000 square miles, is about half ash. And it came from the volcanic arc that came over, happened during Noah's flood, and it's going to be burying these creatures. So that's why the dinosaurs are found inside of the products that was responsible for their death. So a little bit more on that. Here's the Independence Dyke Swarm, what it might have looked like. You have these linear rifts coming up. It's going to be bellowing out huge volumes of ash. It's going to blanket, cover about half of America, and create huge deposits over here like the Brushy Basin member and others. It's going to just bury these dinosaurs in massive volumes of ash. Here's how much ash was produced by the Independence Dyke Swarm compared to Mount St. Helens that went off during the 1980s. That's about 1/4 of 1 cubic mile of ash. This was over 4,000 cubic miles of ash. So we can just see by contrast how much more ash was produced during the process of Noah's flood. So here's what the brushy basin member would have looked like. It's about half ash. It covers 4 partial states, about 600 miles long by about 300 miles wide, about 200,000 square miles. So a lot of that came from a volcanic arc. Some would argue it didn't necessarily come from the Independence Spike Swarm, but it definitely came from what's called a volcanic arc when the subducting plates were going on during the flood. Here we have some good evidence. This is in North Dakota. It's called the Tanis fossil bed, where we can see the actual tsunami processes that laid down these fossils. We have incredibly well preserved fossils here from fish and dinosaurs. Even this theropod here was very, very well preserved. We have fish gills and fish fins that are incredibly well preserved in this area because they were rapidly entombed by the sheets that were coming over with the tsunamis. Scientists have even determined 2 specific tsunamis that hit that area, bringing in all kinds of mud and sediment, then retreating back. They've even determined the direction of how the tsunamis came in and backed out. So here we have actual physical evidence we can go today showing that tsunami action coming in and peeling back, coming in and peeling back was responsible for the well-preserved fossils that we see, and it's responsible for burying them in layers, which is exactly the mechanism that would have been produced by the catastrophic plate tectonics during the flood. So the dinosaurs are really killed and buried by the processes and products that buried them. They didn't just go lay down there and buried, thousands or millions of years afterward. They were buried and killed in the mud, sand, and ash that was responsible for their death. It's a different way of looking at it. Okay, so evidence 7 is that we have these massive oceanic plates that were dragged underneath the continents. So here we have the Farallon plate. You can use underground X-rays to go look down, and you can see the subducting plate that's still down there. It's even got heat different signatures on it, so we can see it clearly did subduct underneath North America. That happened during the flood. The Farallon plate subducted. We can even see it here on a secular animation. We, of course, don't agree with the timeline. We think it happened much more quickly. That's called the conjugate Shatsky rise. It's going to come from the south west over here and go this diagonal region. That's going to be responsible for a lot of the different volcanics that we're seeing happening, burying all these dinosaurs here. But that's what's coming up and moving during the flood that's going to be responsible for burying a lot of these dinosaurs in those regions. So what about the fossil order? Let's take a look at that next. So if we have this going on, and this is really true, we have these fountains of the Great Deep breaking open, forming new seafloors, and it's going to come over and hit the land margins, we would expect to see certain things if this was really the case. We would expect to see the shallow seas and the coastal regions and the lowlands buried first. That's going to be why we see most of these regions buried in the initial phases of the flood, and that's why what evolutionists would call the more simple life forms and the marine life forms are buried lower. Same evidence, just a different way of looking at it. We don't think they were buried older in time. They just happened to be buried at an earlier stage during Noah's flood as the water came up directionally from the ocean, leaving sheet flow up, coming up, and repeating tsunamis coming up and sheeting back, coming up and sheeting back. It's a clear mechanism that is actually validated by how we see these dinosaurs buried today. We don't have much time to get into this, but there's actually a lot of research that shows what's called the Sloss megasequences. There were 6 of these, showing that there was ways that the sand and the shale and the limestone were graded and sifted out during the megasequences that happened during Noah's flood. Dr. Tim Clary from the Institute for Creation Research has investigated this a lot and has actually mapped them out using 1,800 oil boreholes all around the major different continents, showing the mega sequences that happened during the flood. We have the first mega sequence called the Sauk, which is where all the marine life is going to be buried first, followed by the Tippecanoe, which is going to be shallow marine creatures. Then we have the Kaskaskia Sloss mega sequence. It's going to bury the shallow marine creatures a little bit higher. Then we have the Absaroka, which was where we're going to have the first land creature starting to show up in the fossil record, followed by the peak of the flood, which is called the Zuni mega sequence, and that's where we see the big land creatures buried. And when we plot this all out, it's very interesting where we can see they look like pancakes that are buried one on top of the other. This is a clip from a great movie called Is Genesis History that shows these mega sequences buried one on top of the other like major pancakes, with the marine fossils buried in the lower layers, followed by the land creatures. And that's why when we plot this out, we can see the first the three mega sequences are burying mostly marine life. Then when you get up higher to the Zuni and Absaroka, you're going to see the land creatures, thanks to ICR for these slides. Here is a frequency distribution showing that the proportion of land creatures compared to the marine creatures, these land creatures, if you do a frequency plot of the land creatures, they only really start showing up in the Absaroka Sloss mega sequences. This is exactly what we would expect during Noah's flood, when you have first the marine life being buried, then the shallow seas being buried, then the lowlands, followed by the highlands, where you're going to have all these land creatures. It's a model that perfectly is in alignment with Noah's flood. Evidence number 9, just 2 more here. We'll go through and look at correlated fossils and oil. This, for me, is very, very profound evidence. If we look at today and we spin the globe, we come right between these 2 continents and look at the mid-Atlantic ridge. As I mentioned before, we've got a 3,000-mile spread here from Brazil over to this little notch over here. We can see that this notch fits perfectly as the continents fit back like pieces of a puzzle. They're spread apart by 3,000 miles, and the mid-Atlantic ridge is about halfway between them. That's what split during Noah's flood. We can see the mid-Atlantic ridge here again, and we can see Pangaea splitting apart. That's what it would have looked like when the fountains of the Great Deep broke open. Well, how do we know this happened rapidly? How do we know that it happened fast? Well, we have lots of evidence, because if we plot the fossil record, which is what all these little dots are, each one of these dots represents not one fossil find, but usually fossil beds. There's tons of fossils on this little horn here. But the amazing thing is if you take Brazil and fit it right back in here with Africa, you can have all these fossil beds begin correlating. The same types of plants and animals found over here are the same types of plants and animals you find over here. So when you put them back together, you see a massive ecosystem that was rapidly and catastrophically pushed apart over about the first 150-day period of the flood. As the fountains of the Great Deep break open, they're spreading these continents apart, and they're dividing brothers and sisters and cousins, so to speak, in this area, pushing them apart. And that's why we have the same plants and animals that we can find today on either matching side of these continents when we put them back together. Oil testifies in the same way. We can take these different oil deposits that are on each side of the matching puzzles of these continent sides, and we can correlate the chemical signature of these oil deposits, and lo and behold, they're the same types of plants and animals that led to the same types of oil chemistry signatures that we see on each location. So now we have the plants, the animals, and the oil signatures showing not only that they used to be a same ecosystem, it shows that they were rapidly spread apart and killed in the mud that deposited them in the process that moved these continents apart. It's incredible telling evidence of Noah's flood. The last one we'll take a look at is the massive receding waters, and obviously sheeted off the continents first in sheets and then developed channelized cuts. God says in Genesis 8, verses 1 and 2, that God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep of the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. So God stopped the fountains of the great deep on this day. When that happened, the ocean would have declined or descended down, lowered down, and it's going to bring the sheet flow first off the continents, because when the ocean floor sunk, it's going to pull the ocean waters back off the continents, first in sheet flow and then in channelized cuts. And that's why we have things that the geologists call the Whopper sand here in the Gulf of America. It's over 1,000 feet deep. All this sand came from the continents as it was peeled off, and we have huge erosional features that are found here. But the whopper sand happened when the receding stages of the flood hit. We can also see this in California in Morro Bay, where you go over here, and it's actually Monterey Bay, and we have a canyon, an underwater canyon here that's actually larger than the Grand Canyon. It's a huge erosional feature, bigger than the Grand Canyon, and it shows how the water just came off and hit this little notch and flowed down and created all these erosional features that wash down out in the middle of the ocean. Hundreds and hundreds of miles of erosional features that are right off the continental margins. So why is this all important? Let me conclude real quick here. I know it's been a longer time than we expected, but if you look at the book of Genesis and you want to have fruit as a Christian, I think it requires some level of belief system that requires faith. I've just showed you some good evidence that can help drive your faith, because faith is not necessarily the absence of evidence. And so we can see here that if we want to have fruit as a Christian, you've got to have a strong root system. What's happening with a lot of students today is they're not producing a lot of fruit, and they don't have a strong belief system because they run into snags with their belief systems, like what about Darwin? What about science versus the Bible, or ape to human evolution? Or what about deep time compared to the book of Genesis? All of these things will stop and sometimes hinder the root systems of these students to go down deep and penetrate so that they can have good fruit. You ask any farmer what's going to produce good fruit, it's going to be a strong root system, and we think that should all begin in the book of Genesis. So thank you very much for having me today, and if you have any questions, my email is dan@genesisapologetics.com. I'd be happy to answer. Thank you very much.